Dad opened the door. On a freezing Christmas night, I stood trembling on my father's porch, clutching my soaking wet 1-year-old daughter. "He brought his mistress home," I whispered. His mother packed up our things, threw the two of us out, and locked the door. My father looked at his little granddaughter shivering from the cold. Then he tightened his grip on the ring of keys in his hand. They picked the wrong family. My name is Kiara. I am 30 years old, and I am the operations director for a major logistics firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws who underestimated your intelligence. The Portland sleet was coming down in sheets that felt like crushed glass against my windshield. I had just finished a grueling 60-hour week at the logistics firm, making sure holiday freight moved across the country without a hitch. My body ached with a bone-deep exhaustion that only a working mother can truly understand. All I wanted was to walk into my beautiful suburban home, hold my husband Marcus, and put our baby girl Zuri to bed so we could wake up to a peaceful Christmas morning. We had been married for 5 years and together for 8. Marcus was a legacy child born into a wealthy African-American family that owned a highly lucrative commercial real estate brokerage and a chain of luxury car showrooms. From the outside, we were the perfect, successful couple. But as I pulled into our driveway, the illusion of my perfect life shattered into a million jagged pieces. Sitting in the middle of the snow-covered driveway, getting completely ruined by the freezing rain, was my luggage. It was not just thrown out carelessly, it was displayed intentionally. The expensive designer suitcases I had purchased for Marcus for our anniversary were sitting next to my cheap canvas duffel bags from my college days. I parked the car with my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I unbuckled Zuri from her car seat, wrapping her tightly in my heavy wool coat to shield her from the bitter wind. I walked up the icy steps and pushed open the heavy oak front door, expecting to find that we had been robbed. Instead, the house was suffocatingly warm and smelled of expensive cinnamon candles and roasted pine. Holiday jazz music played softly from the surround sound speakers. Standing in the center of our massive vaulted living room was Marcus. He was not alone. He was wrapping his arms around Chloe, a 24-year-old social media influencer I recognized from local society pages. Chloe was everything my in-laws valued. She was very light-skinned, came from a prominent local political family, and spent her days curating a pristine online aesthetic rather than working a demanding corporate job. Sitting on the custom leather sofa, swirling a glass of expensive champagne, was my mother-in-law, Vivian. Vivian was the absolute epitome of the wealthy bougie elite. She spent her entire life climbing social ladders, joining exclusive clubs, and judging anyone who did not meet her impossible standards of generational wealth. I stood in the entryway, dripping freezing water onto the imported hardwood floors, clutching my crying daughter. Vivian did not even flinch when she saw Zuri crying. She simply took another sip of her champagne and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She told me to look at myself. She said I worked like a mule, laboring for 60 hours a week like a common servant. She mocked my working-class roots, pointing out that I did not come from a family of doctors or lawyers. She looked at my natural hair and my dark skin and told me that I was too rough and too independent for a man of her son's stature. Vivian loudly declared that Chloe was the proper pedigree for their family line, and that it was time to correct the mistake Marcus had made by marrying beneath his station. Marcus did not defend me. The man I had loved and supported did not even look me in the eye. He casually walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up a thick stack of legal documents, and slid them across the marble surface toward me. He told me they were divorce papers. He had already signed them. He demanded that I sign them immediately and leave the premises. When I asked about our home, our bank accounts, and our shared life, he laughed coldly. He told me that I was entitled to absolutely nothing. He claimed that every asset we had was protected by his family's corporate structure, and that I was just a temporary guest who had overstayed her welcome. He pointed to the door and told me to take my cheap bags and go back to the neighborhood I came from. I did not scream. I did not drop to my knees and beg him to reconsider. I did not give Vivian the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in front of the young woman who was currently standing in my living room wearing my husband's sweater. I simply tightened my grip around my daughter, pulled my coat closer around her small body, and turned my back on the people who had just destroyed my universe. I walked back out into the freezing Portland storm. The drive to my father's house was the longest and most dangerous journey of my life. The roads were slick with black ice and visibility was almost zero. Zuri cried in the back seat, confused and cold, while silent tears finally began to stream down my face. I felt an overwhelming sense of failure as a mother and as a woman. I had allowed myself to believe that my hard work and dedication would eventually win over my husband's family. I had been completely blind to their cruelty. I navigated the treacherous streets until I reached a quiet, modest suburb on the edge of the city. My father, Darius, lived in a simple ranch-style home that he kept immaculately clean. Darius was 60 years old and had recently retired. But he was not just any retiree. For over 30 years, my father had worked as a senior auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. He was a man who had spent his entire career untangling the most complex webs of corporate fraud, tax evasion, and financial deception. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a mind that operated like a steel trap. I pounded on his front door, shivering violently as the wind howled around us. When he opened the door and saw us standing there soaked and freezing, his expression shifted from surprise to immediate focused action. He pulled us inside out of the brutal cold. He took Zuri from my arms and wrapped her in a thick, warm blanket before handing her back to me. He guided me to the sofa and brought me a cup of hot tea. I sat there shaking uncontrollably and poured out the entire humiliating story. I told him about Marcus and Chloe, about Vivian's vicious words regarding my skin and my background, and about the divorce papers demanding I walk away with absolutely nothing. Darius did not react the way a normal father might. He did not yell or shout curses, or threaten to drive over to Marcus's house and engage in a physical fight. Emotional outbursts were for people who did not know how to systematically dismantle their enemies. Instead, my father walked over to the window and looked out into the dark, snowy night. He processed the information, sorting it into mental categories of assets, liabilities, vulnerabilities, and penalties. He looked back at his little granddaughter, who was finally warming up and falling asleep against my chest. He reached into his pocket and gripped his ring of keys tightly. His voice was completely devoid of panic, but heavy with a chilling, absolute certainty. He looked at me and said they picked the wrong family. We spent the rest of that night getting settled into my old childhood bedroom. The familiarity of the space brought a small measure of comfort, but the reality of my situation kept me awake. I lay there listening to the storm outside, wondering how I was going to rebuild my life from scratch. I worried about how I would afford a lawyer to fight a family with seemingly endless resources. I worried about how I would provide the life I had promised my daughter. But downstairs I could hear my father moving around in his home office. I could hear the hum of his computer and the rustle of papers. Darius was already at work, and when a retired IRS senior auditor decides to look into your finances, your days of living comfortably are numbered. Christmas morning dawned bright and bitterly cold. There were no presents under a tree for Zuri and no joyful holiday music playing in the background. I woke up with a heavy heart and reached for my phone on the nightstand, hoping against hope that the previous night had been a terrible nightmare. Instead, my screen was illuminated with a terrifying barrage of notifications from my banking applications. Red alert symbols filled the screen. Every single joint credit card I shared with Marcus had been canceled. My access to our primary checking and savings accounts had been completely revoked. I was locked out of the financial life I had helped build for almost a decade. Panic started to set in as I opened my email to check my personal accounts. That was when I saw the most devastating notification of all. A withdrawal alert from the financial institution that managed Zuri's 529 college savings plan. Marcus had used his administrative access to completely liquidate the account overnight. The money I had meticulously saved from my bonuses to ensure my daughter would never have to take out student loans was gone. A moment later, a text message from Marcus popped up on my screen. It was a picture of Chloe holding a brand new, highly exclusive designer handbag. The text read that he had bought Chloe a $15,000 Birkin bag to properly welcome her into the family. He told me he used the college fund because Zuri would not be needing an elite education anyway. He ended the message by telling me I could buy my own diapers with my miserable logistics paycheck. My hands shook with a mixture of profound grief and boiling rage. I opened social media hoping to find some distraction, but the algorithm immediately served me a post from Vivian. She had uploaded a professional quality photograph of herself, Marcus and Chloe, posing in front of their massive Christmas tree, holding crystal champagne flutes. The caption was a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty. It read that she was so incredibly blessed this Christmas morning to finally cleanse the family tree of low-class burdens. She officially welcomed Chloe as her true daughter, claiming the universe had finally corrected a terrible mistake. I could see all their wealthy society friends liking the post and leaving comments congratulating them on the beautiful new addition to their family circle. The dam finally broke. I sat on the edge of the bed and wept. I cried for the years I had wasted trying to be the perfect wife and daughter-in-law. I cried for my baby girl, who had been robbed of her future by her own father just so he could impress his mistress. The tears were hot and blinding. Just then, the door to the bedroom opened, and my father walked in. Darius took one look at my tear-stained face and the glowing phone in my hand, and he knew exactly what was happening. He walked over to the nightstand and set down a steaming mug of black coffee. Then he pulled a chair up to the bed and placed a fresh yellow legal notepad and a sharp black pen on the mattress beside me. He sat down and looked me squarely in the eyes. His voice was gentle but commanded absolute authority. He told me that the emotional crying stopped right here and right now. He explained that tears do not pay legal fees and sorrow does not freeze bank accounts. He pointed to the yellow notepad and told me it was time to transition from a grieving victim to a tactical commander. We were going to map out every single asset, every single vulnerability, and every single secret that family possessed. We were going to build a comprehensive strategy to legally, financially, and socially dismantle the people who thought they could throw us out into the snow. I wiped my face, picked up the pen, and took a sip of the bitter coffee. The mourning period was officially over. The tactical planning had begun. As we sat there mapping out our initial survival strategy, another notification chimed from my laptop. It was an email with the subject line regarding your transition. I opened it to find a message from Brad. Brad was 38 years old, a ruthless white real estate developer who was married to Marcus's sister, Lauren. Lauren was an exact replica of Vivian, equally snobby, obsessed with status, and deeply resentful of anyone who actually had to work for a living. Brad had married into the family specifically to gain access to the minority business elite and local political contracts. He was a vulture who thrived on exploiting vulnerable situations. Brad's email was dripping with condescending fake sympathy. He wrote that he was so deeply sorry to hear about the unfortunate situation with Marcus, but that business must proceed as usual. He stated that he wanted to help me transition to my new life as a single mother. He offered to buy out my 5% proxy shares in the family's commercial real estate holding company for a flat cash payment of $10,000. He literally referred to the offer as a generous gift of diaper money to help me get back on my feet. He strongly advised me to sign the attached digital relinquishment forms by the end of the day, warning me that if I waited, the company was going to restructure and I would be left completely empty-handed. I read the email aloud to my father. Darius did not say a word. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his reading glasses, and slid them onto his face. He took the laptop from my hands and carried it down to his home office. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the house was the rapid, aggressive clicking of my father's keyboard. Darius was logging into secured databases, accessing public property registries, pulling corporate shell company filings, and cross-referencing tax documents. He was utilizing the exact same digital forensic tools he had used for 3 decades to hunt down corporate tax evaders and white-collar criminals. When he finally called me down to the office, he had a web of printed documents spread across his desk. He pointed to a highlighted section on a newly filed corporate intent form. Brad's generous offer of $10,000 was a smokescreen for something massive. Darius had uncovered the real motive behind the rush to get my signature. Brad was currently manipulating Marcus into selling the prime commercial land where the luxury car dealership sat. The buyer was a massive corporate conglomerate secretly owned by Brad himself. The payout for the land was an astonishing $20 million. Darius explained the timeline. Marcus and Brad needed to execute the sale before the end of the fiscal year to exploit a massive tax loophole. But because my name was still listed as a proxy shareholder on the foundational documents of the holding company, they could not legally transfer the title without my signature clearing the title history. They were trying to erase me from the paperwork for pennies before the ink dried on a $20 million payout. They thought because I was grieving and desperate, I would just take the $10,000 and run away quietly. They completely underestimated who they were dealing with. They thought they were manipulating a helpless single mother, but they had just handed a roadmap of their criminal conspiracy directly to an IRS auditor and an operations director. The trap was set and they were walking right into it. The hum of the computer processor felt like the only sound left in the world. I sat across from my father in his dimly lit office, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The glow of the dual monitors illuminated his face, carving deep shadows into his focused expression. Darius did not just look at numbers. He interrogated them. For 30 years, he had dismantled the financial illusions of billionaires and corporate frauds. Now he was turning that exact same predatory focus onto the people who had thrown his daughter and granddaughter out into a blizzard. He reached over to a locked filing cabinet and pulled out a thick leather binder. It contained his personal archives access codes to secure public record databases, property registries, and federal tax lien portals. My father began to type. His fingers moved with a rhythmic, aggressive precision. We started with Vivian. For as long as I had known her, my mother-in-law had projected an aura of untouchable generational wealth. She wore her society memberships like armor, wielding her status at the country club to intimidate anyone she deemed beneath her. She had constantly reminded me that my working-class background was a stain on their impeccable family pedigree. But as Darius pulled up the unredacted financial histories, the reality of Vivian's perfect life bled onto the screen in sharp red numbers. It was entirely fake. The sprawling estate she hosted her lavish galas in was mortgaged to the absolute limit. She had taken out 3 separate high-interest predatory loans just to maintain the illusion of liquidity. The luxury cars, the designer wardrobes, the expensive club fees, they were all being financed by a mountain of toxic debt that was teetering on the edge of total collapse. I leaned forward, staring at the screen in complete disbelief. My father pointed to a series of offshore transfers and maxed-out credit lines. Vivian was not a wealthy matriarch. She was a financial hostage to her own vanity. She was bleeding cash every single month just to keep her wealthy friends from realizing she was completely broke. That was why she hated me so much. I had earned my money through grueling logistics work while she was drowning in the shame of living a lie. Her relentless cruelty toward my dark skin and my upbringing was nothing more than a desperate smokescreen to hide her own terrifying reality. But Vivian was only the appetizer. Darius shifted his focus to Marcus and the luxury car dealership. The deeper my father dug, the darker the picture became. The dealership was hemorrhaging money. Marcus had been cooking the books for years, inflating inventory values and taking out fraudulent business loans to cover his personal expenses. The $15,000 Birkin bag he had bought for Chloe using my daughter's college fund was just a drop in the bucket. He had been siphoning corporate funds to pay for Chloe's luxury apartment, her vacations, and her lifestyle, all while the business was functionally insolvent. He was a hollow man, playing the role of a successful chief executive, but his entire empire was built on stolen money and fragile ego. Then my father turned his attention to the true prize. The $20 million real estate deal between Marcus and Brad. This was the transaction that was supposed to save them all. Brad had engineered a buyout of the commercial land where the dealership sat, assuming it belonged to Marcus. Darius opened a new terminal window tracing the origin of Brad's corporate conglomerate. It did not take long for the seasoned auditor to find the rotting core of their conspiracy. Brad had set up a complex network of shell companies designed to artificially inflate the value of the land before the sale. By moving the asset through these ghost entities, Brad and Marcus were attempting to execute a massive wire fraud scheme. They had deliberately falsified property appraisal documents to secure a highly inflated corporate buyout from Brad's parent company. It was a textbook embezzlement strategy. But they had gone a step further. To avoid paying capital gains taxes on the $20 million, Marcus and Brad had buried a series of illegal tax evasion loopholes deep within the contract clauses. They planned to route the funds through a fake charitable foundation Vivian had recently registered, claiming the profits as tax-exempt community development grants. The sheer arrogance of their plan was staggering. They believed they were smarter than the system. They believed they could steal millions, evade federal taxes, and completely erase me from the company proxy all in one swift motion. They were so blinded by their own greed and their absolute certainty in their bougie invincibility that they left a digital trail a mile wide. Darius leaned back in his chair, taking a slow, deep breath. He did not smile. He simply began compiling the evidence. He printed out bank statements, wire transfer logs, fake appraisal documents, and the fraudulent tax exemption filings. He organized the papers into pristine, color-coded folders. Each folder represented a different federal offense: wire fraud, bank fraud, tax evasion, grand larceny. He was methodically constructing a guillotine. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a number belonging to a former colleague currently serving as a senior director at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He did not make the call yet. The timing had to be absolute perfection. I watched my father seal the evidence into a heavy manila envelope. The fear and heartbreak that had consumed me on Christmas Eve were completely gone. They had been replaced by a cold, mechanical clarity. Marcus, Vivian, and Brad had tried to bury me. They had tried to leave me and my daughter with absolutely nothing. But as I looked at the undeniable proof of their federal crimes sitting on the desk, I realized they had already destroyed themselves. The ledger was closed. I smiled. The smile that touched my lips was not born of mere vindication, but from the absolute staggering irony of the situation. Marcus, Brad, and Vivian believed they had just outsmarted a naive working-class woman. They thought they had successfully severed me from the family fortune before I could demand my rightful share. But the profound, beautifully devastating truth was that there was no family fortune left for me to take. I did not need to steal a slice of their pie because I already owned the entire bakery. To understand the sheer magnitude of their impending ruin, you have to go back exactly 3 years to the darkest chapter of Marcus's so-called empire. At that time, the luxury car dealership was barely keeping its lights on. Vivian, in her relentless pursuit of high society dominance, had treated the corporate accounts like her personal piggy bank. She funded lavish charity galas, sponsored tables at exclusive country clubs, and took extravagant shopping trips to Paris, all under the guise of corporate networking. She bled the operational capital dry. The cash flow completely halted, and the bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on the massive commercial lot that housed their flagship showroom. It was the crown jewel of the family legacy, and Vivian had gambled it away for designer clothes and social validation. Marcus discovered the foreclosure notices and immediately spiraled into a toxic, paralyzing panic. Blinded by his own ego and terrified of losing his status among the local elite, he completely shut down. He hid the bank letters deep inside his briefcase, drinking heavily every night and pretending everything was perfectly fine. He was far too proud to ask his wealthy friends for a bailout. and his fragile masculinity absolutely forbade him from asking his wife for help. He would rather watch his family face absolute disgrace and homelessness than admit to a woman, especially a woman he deemed beneath him, that he had failed. But I was never just a basic employee making a modest paycheck. As an operations director managing global logistics supply chains, I operated in a world of high-stakes efficiency and massive profit margins. For years, I had quietly earned monumental performance bonuses. Because I came from a background where survival meant financial literacy, I never flaunted my income. I drove a sensible car, wore tailored but understated clothes, and funneled every single bonus check into aggressive high-yield investment portfolios and index funds. I had quietly amassed a self-made net worth that completely dwarfed whatever liquid cash my in-laws pretended to have. When I accidentally discovered the final foreclosure warning buried under a stack of magazines in Marcus's home office, I did not confront him. I did not scream or demand an explanation or humiliate him for his failure. Out of a deep, sincere love and a naive sense of duty to my marriage vows, I decided to fix the problem myself. But my logistics background had taught me to always protect my assets. I hired a notoriously cutthroat and highly discreet corporate attorney based in Delaware. Together, we established a blind, limited liability company. It was a completely airtight shell corporation, a fortress of legal paperwork designed specifically to shield the true identity of its owner from all public registries and tax databases. Operating entirely through this anonymous entity, I wired the exact amount needed to halt the foreclosure. I did not just pay off the immediate debt, I bought the distressed banknote in its entirety. I satisfied the massive outstanding loans and purchased the commercial deed outright. In one swift, completely invisible transaction, I became the absolute uncontested owner of the prime real estate that sat directly beneath their luxury car showroom. I literally bought the ground they walked on, saving them from a public humiliation that would have destroyed Vivian's precious social standing. To keep Marcus's ego intact and the family dynamic peaceful, my attorney drafted a highly formal communication to the dealership. Marcus and Vivian were informed that a powerful out-of-state corporate conglomerate had purchased the land from the bank. The letters stated that the new owners were willing to act as landlords and let the dealership remain on the property provided they signed a strict ironclad commercial lease agreement. Marcus was so overwhelmingly relieved to avoid bankruptcy and public ruin that he signed the lease without asking a single question. For 3 entire years, Marcus, Vivian, and eventually Brad had been writing massive, exorbitant rent checks on the first of every month. They mailed those checks to a faceless corporate post office box, complaining bitterly about their aggressive, greedy out-of-state landlord. They had absolutely no idea that the landlord they despised was the exact same woman sitting at their dinner table. They had no idea that the woman Vivian mocked for her dark skin and working-class roots was the sole reason they were not living in a cramped apartment. The money they paid in rent went straight into my private corporate accounts, building my wealth, while they struggled to keep up appearances. Now looking at the fraudulent documents Darius had pulled from the Federal Registry, the poetic justice of the situation was almost suffocating. Brad and Marcus were aggressively plotting to sell a $20 million piece of commercial real estate to a corporate buyer. They were manipulating tax codes, hiding money in fake charities, and brutally throwing me out into a blizzard to ensure I could not touch a single dime of the profits. But Marcus did not own a single grain of dirt on that property. He was legally attempting to sell land that belonged entirely, absolutely, and exclusively to me. The commercial lease agreement that my attorney had drafted 3 years ago was a masterpiece of corporate protection. It included a very specific, very rigid termination clause. If the lease was not formally renewed and signed by both parties 60 days before its expiration, the tenancy would immediately transition to a daily rate, and the landlord retained the absolute right to evict the tenant with zero notice. Marcus, consumed by his affair with Chloe and distracted by Brad's greedy promises of $20 million, had completely forgotten to renew the lease. The contract had officially expired at exactly midnight on Christmas Eve. The very same night, Marcus handed me a divorce paper, and Vivian demanded I leave their property empty-handed. They had officially become illegal squatters on my land. Every luxury vehicle parked on that lot, every desk in that showroom, every single asset tied to that physical location was currently sitting on my private property without a valid lease. They had spent the entire holiday weekend celebrating my departure and planning their glamorous future, completely unaware that they had just handed me the legal authority to seize everything they possessed. They wanted to strip me of my dignity and my resources. They wanted to leave me and my daughter shivering in the cold. But instead, they had unknowingly armed me with a financial nuclear weapon, and I was fully prepared to detonate it. The morning of December 26th brought a sharp, blinding sunlight that reflected off the frozen Portland streets. The storm had broken, leaving a brittle layer of ice over the city. I left Zuri sleeping peacefully under the watchful eye of a trusted retired neighbor my father had known for decades. Darius and I drove downtown in complete silence. We were headed to the top floor of a sleek glass high-rise that housed one of the most feared corporate law firms on the West Coast. We were there to see Elias Vance. Elias was a senior partner specializing in cutthroat commercial real estate litigation. He was the man I had retained 3 years ago to establish the Blind LLC and manage the transaction that saved my in-laws from ruin. Elias did not care about family drama or high society politics. He cared about watertight contracts, billable hours, and absolute legal dominance. When we stepped into his expansive corner office overlooking the river, Elias was already waiting. He had my entire corporate portfolio laid out across his massive mahogany desk. I sat down and slid my laptop across the polished wood, pulling up the digital trail Darius had uncovered the night before. I showed Elias the preliminary paperwork Brad and Marcus had circulated regarding the $20 million land sale. I explained how they were trying to force a buyout of my proxy shares for a pathetic $10,000 to clear the title. Elias stared at the screen for a long moment. He adjusted his glasses and let out a dry, humorless laugh. He looked at me with an expression of pure professional astonishment. He said he had seen incredible acts of corporate stupidity in his 30-year career, but attempting to sell commercial property you do not own, while actively renting it from a shadow corporation, was a completely new level of financial suicide. Elias reached for the thick stack of bound documents on his desk. He pulled out the original commercial lease agreement that Marcus had signed 3 years ago. When I had originally purchased the distressed banknote, I instructed Elias to draft a lease that was fair but fiercely protective of my asset. It required standard monthly payments, but it also included a very rigid non-negotiable renewal clause. Elias opened the file and read the exact stipulations aloud. To legally renew the commercial lease, the tenant was required to submit a formal signed declaration of intent exactly 60 days prior to the expiration date. If that deadline was missed, the lease dictated that the tenant must pay a severe penalty fee to initiate an emergency extension. If both deadlines were ignored, the lease would automatically terminate. We reviewed the correspondence logs. Elias had dutifully sent 3 separate certified letters and over a dozen automated emails to the dealership's corporate inbox, warning them of the impending expiration. Marcus had ignored every single one of them. He had tossed the certified letters into the trash without opening them. I knew exactly why Marcus had ignored the warnings. He was blinded by his own generational arrogance. He genuinely believed that because his family had operated a business on that corner for 2 decades, the land was his by divine right. He assumed the out-of-state corporate landlord was just making empty bureaucratic threats. He and Vivian thought their local status made them completely untouchable. They operated under the delusion that rules and deadlines were meant for working-class people, not for the elite. Elias tapped his expensive pen against the heavy parchment paper. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. He stated that the lease had officially expired at exactly 11:59 on Christmas Eve. The timing was almost too perfectly poetic to comprehend. At the exact second, Marcus was standing in his warm living room, handing me divorce papers and throwing his wife and child out into a freezing blizzard. He was simultaneously forfeiting his legal right to operate his family empire. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He asked Elias to clarify their current legal standing. Elias did not hesitate. He explained that because the lease had expired and Marcus had failed to vacate the premises, the luxury car dealership was no longer a legitimate tenant. Marcus, Vivian, and their entire operation were now officially classified as illegal commercial squatters. They had absolutely zero legal right to be on that property. The room fell silent as the gravity of that statement settled in. I told Elias to prepare the paperwork. I wanted a legal instrument so devastating and so airtight that no judge in the state would even consider granting them an injunction. Elias went to work immediately. He drafted a brutal, unchallengeable 24-hour notice of eviction. The document cited the expired lease, the ignored renewal warnings, and the illegal occupation of the commercial lot. It mandated that the premises be completely vacated within 1 day of service, but Elias was a master of his craft, and he did not stop at a simple eviction. He turned to the second page and activated the most terrifying clause in the original contract. Because Marcus was now occupying the property illegally, he was incurring a massive daily penalty rate for unauthorized commercial use. Furthermore, he had missed the final balloon payment of rent that was due on the 1st of December. Elias drafted a comprehensive seizure of assets clause. He legally tied every single piece of inventory on that lot directly to the unpaid back rent and the exorbitant squatting penalties. He explained that if Marcus and Vivian failed to vacate the premises and immediately pay the massive sum owed, my LLC had the absolute legal authority to seize everything. Every single high-end luxury vehicle parked in that showroom, every desk, every computer, and every piece of diagnostic equipment would automatically become collateral. It was a financial guillotine. Once the document was signed and served, Marcus would lose the land, the business, and his entire inventory in a matter of 24 hours. He would be left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back. Elias printed the final draft. The paper was warm from the printer. He placed it in front of me and set a heavy brass pen down beside it. He told me that he had process servers standing by. He could have the documents delivered to the dealership by noon. He was ready to shut their operation down before the lunch hour was over. I picked up the pen and held it in my hand. I stared at the bold legal lettering that possessed the power to permanently erase my in-laws from high society. I thought about the sheer humiliation of Christmas Eve. I thought about Chloe parading around my living room and Vivian mocking my skin tone. I thought about Brad trying to buy me off for diaper money. I placed the pen down on the desk without signing the document. Elias looked confused. He asked if there was a problem with the wording. My father, however, simply leaned back in his chair and watched me with a look of quiet understanding. Darius knew exactly how my mind worked. I looked at my attorney and told him that the document was perfect. It was a masterpiece of legal destruction. But I explained that serving this notice on a random Tuesday morning would give them time to scramble in the shadows. It would allow Vivian to hide her shame and let Marcus run to his wealthy friends for private loans. It would allow Brad to quietly slink away from his fraudulent $20 million real estate deal without public consequences. I instructed Elias to hold the paperwork. I told him to keep the eviction notice and the asset seizure mandate locked in his vault. We were not going to serve them quietly in the middle of a work week. I wanted the execution to be spectacular. I wanted to strike at the exact moment they felt the most invincible. I wanted them surrounded by the very society they valued above their own family. Elias slowly smiled a sharp, predatory grin. He closed the thick leather folder and slid it into his top drawer, turning the key with a heavy metallic click. The guillotine was built sharpened and ready to drop. We just needed to wait for them to place their heads on the block. We stood up to leave the office. As we walked toward the elevator, my father placed a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. We had the corporate eviction ready. Darius had the federal tax evasion evidence packaged for the IRS. The invisible trap was completely set. Now it was time to let Vivian and Marcus put on a show and dig their graves just a little bit deeper. The high society smear campaign began exactly 3 days after I was thrown out into the freezing rain. Vivian had never been a woman to handle family matters with quiet dignity. For her, social warfare was a brutal spectator sport, and she was determined to strike the first devastating blow. She and Lauren hastily organized an extravagant end-of-year brunch at the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was the exact same club that was currently threatening to revoke Vivian's membership for 6 months of unpaid luxury dining dues. Of course, none of the attendees knew that. The guest list was meticulously curated to include the wealthiest, most influential members of the local Black elite. There were prominent judges, city council members, high-profile doctors, and legacy business owners. Vivian's objective was crystal clear. She needed to aggressively control the narrative of her son's sudden divorce before I could tell my side of the story. She needed to publicly execute my reputation so that Chloe could be seamlessly integrated into their pristine family portrait without a single whisper of scandal. I sat at the small wooden dining table in my father's kitchen, quietly watching the entire spectacle unfold in high definition. Chloe had strategically positioned her smartphone on a portable ring light to live stream the extravagant event to her hundreds of thousands of followers. The camera captured the glittering crystal chandeliers, the towering displays of imported seafood, and the endless flow of expensive vintage mimosas. And there, positioned perfectly in the absolute center of the digital frame, was the $15,000 Birkin bag. Chloe made a grand theatrical show of reaching into it, stroking the premium imported leather, and casually mentioning to her audience how incredibly blessed she was to be welcomed into a family that finally knew how to treat a woman like a queen. The bag was a glaring neon symbol of my daughter's stolen future. It was purchased directly with the money I had tirelessly saved for Zuri's college education. Yet as I watched Chloe parade it around the room, showing it off to the wealthy guests, I did not feel a single ounce of sadness or regret. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical anticipation. Lauren stepped into the camera frame holding a crystal champagne flute. She leaned her head against Chloe and smiled brightly for the live stream audience. She began making thinly veiled, deeply venomous comments about how refreshing it was for her brother to finally be with a woman who understood true femininity. Lauren loudly proclaimed to the camera that some women are so busy trying to act like men, working grueling 60-hour weeks and carrying corporate stress that they completely forget how to be a proper supportive wife. She was directly mocking my career in logistics. She was mocking the exact same corporate career that had generated the millions of dollars currently keeping her entire family from filing for bankruptcy and living on the street. The profound irony of her statement was so thick it was almost tangible. The camera eventually panned across the opulent room to capture Vivian. My mother-in-law was sitting in a plush velvet armchair holding an impromptu exclusive interview with the editor of a highly prominent local society blog. The blogger, a woman notorious for destroying reputations, was eating up every single word. Vivian adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, a piece I knew for an absolute fact was heavily financed at a predatory interest rate, and began her public assassination of my character. She spoke with a rehearsed, sorrowful tone that masked her vicious intent. She claimed that Marcus had been terribly naive and far too generous when he married me. She told the blogger that her son possessed a huge heart and had been ruthlessly trapped by a calculated low-class gold digger who only wanted unrestricted access to their generational wealth. But Vivian did not stop at basic classism. She pushed right into the ugly, toxic territory of colorism, knowing exactly what kind of damage those words could inflict in our community. She praised Chloe's delicate features, her light skin, and her refined political pedigree. She continuously contrasted Chloe with me, using coded language that everyone in the room perfectly understood. She described me as harsh, aggressive, and lacking the natural grace required to move seamlessly in their elevated circles. Vivian explicitly stated that a man of Marcus's exceptional caliber needed a partner who physically and socially reflected his status, not someone who constantly threatened to drag him back to the struggle. She smiled for the camera, raised her glass, and declared that the family tree had finally been pruned of its dead weight, allowing the true legacy to flourish. The livestream chat was moving at lightning speed. Chloe's followers were flooding the comments with toxic validation and vicious support. They praised Marcus for upgrading his life. They mocked the anonymous ex-wife who had supposedly fumbled the ultimate bag. They celebrated the illusion of black excellence that Vivian and Marcus were desperately selling them. It was a digital feeding frenzy of shallow materialism and vicious gossip. In my father's kitchen, the only sound was the soft bubbling of the coffee maker and the quiet, happy giggles of Zuri playing with a set of wooden building blocks on the rug. The stark contrast between the chaotic, desperate noise of the country club and the absolute peaceful reality of my current environment was striking. Darius walked into the kitchen, holding a fresh stack of printed financial ledgers. He paused behind my chair and looked at the tablet screen over my shoulder. He watched Vivian holding court and listened to Lauren's arrogant, ringing laughter. My father let out a low, breathy chuckle. He shook his head slowly and poured himself a fresh cup of black coffee. He quietly noted that the louder a person screams about their wealth, the faster they are drowning in their debt. He patted my shoulder affectionately and walked back toward his home office to finalize the federal fraud packets that would ultimately seal their fate. I picked up my mug of chamomile tea and took a slow, deliberate sip. The warm liquid coated my throat as I watched Marcus step into the camera frame to kiss Chloe's cheek. He looked so incredibly smug. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world and vanquished his enemies. He had absolutely no idea that the ground he was standing on was quite literally crumbling beneath his expensive Italian loafers. He had no idea that his mother was a desperate financial hostage, that his brother-in-law was actively plotting to steal his fake payout, and that his despised ex-wife was the absolute uncontested owner of his entire reality. I watched the live stream for another 10 minutes, memorizing their faces and their boundless arrogance. I did not feel triggered by the rampant colorism or the vicious classism. I did not feel humiliated by the public smear campaign designed to ruin my name. When you hold the power to completely annihilate your enemies with a single signature, their insults lose all their venom. Their mockery was just empty noise generated by empty, desperate people fighting to maintain an illusion. I reached out and tapped the screen, ending the live stream and plunging the room back into quiet focus. I pulled my yellow legal notepad closer and began finalizing the guest list for the upcoming New Year's Eve gala. The villains had thoroughly enjoyed their moment in the spotlight. It was almost time to permanently turn out the lights. Across town, completely insulated from the quiet storm brewing in my father's office, Marcus and Brad were busy celebrating their own perceived brilliance. They sat tucked away in the dimly lit VIP section of the Churchill Reserve, an ultra-exclusive members-only cigar lounge in the heart of the financial district. The air was thick with the heavy, sweet smoke of imported Cuban tobacco and the hushed, arrogant conversations of men who believed they owned the city. Marcus was riding an absolute high. He was buzzing with the adrenaline of his new bachelor status, the public validation from Vivian's brunch, and the intoxicating illusion of incoming wealth. He lounged back in an oversized oxblood leather chair, puffing on a $50 cigar, looking every bit the triumphant titan of industry he desperately wanted to be. Sitting directly across from him, separated by a low mahogany table, was Brad. If Marcus was a loud, desperate peacock, Brad was a cold, calculating python. Brad wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture rigid and his eyes completely devoid of warmth. He sipped his neat whiskey, watching his brother-in-law with a mixture of disguised contempt and predatory patience. To Brad, Marcus was not family. Marcus was not a business partner. Marcus was simply a remarkably useful idiot holding the keys to a $20 million gold mine. Brad reached down into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, premium paper. He dropped them onto the mahogany table with a satisfying thud. It was the preliminary sales agreement for the commercial land. Brad masterfully stroked Marcus's fragile ego, praising him for his decisive action. He told Marcus that it took a real man, a true visionary, to recognize when to cut dead weight and make the hard choices for the family legacy. Brad commended him for kicking me out into the snow, insisting that emotional attachments should never stand in the way of generational wealth. He spun a beautiful, captivating lie telling Marcus that this $20 million deal would officially elevate him out of his father's shadow and cement him as the true mastermind of their corporate empire. Marcus swallowed the flattery completely whole. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with sheer greed as he looked at the numbers printed on the contract. He laughed a deep, arrogant sound and boasted about how incredibly easy it had been to discard me. He bragged about freezing my accounts and draining Zuri's college fund, framing it as a brilliant tactical victory rather than an act of cowardice. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted a woman who had spent years out-earning and outmaneuvering him. He told Brad that I was probably crying in a cheap motel somewhere, regretting the day I ever crossed him. He was so completely detached from reality, so utterly absorbed in his own delusion of grandeur, that he did not even bother to read the fine print of the document sitting in front of him. Brad uncaped a heavy gold fountain pen and handed it across the table. He pointed to the dotted line at the bottom of the final page. He told Marcus that this preliminary signature would lock in the corporate funds and initiate the immediate transfer of the $20 million from the parent conglomerate. He framed it as a mere formality, a simple handshake between brothers. Marcus took the pen. He did not hesitate. He did not ask his own legal counsel to review the terms. He did not check the municipal property records. He simply pressed the gold nib to the thick paper and signed his name with a wide, arrogant flourish. The sound of the ink scratching across that page was the sound of a man permanently sealing his own tomb. In that exact fraction of a second, Marcus transitioned from a terrible husband to a federal criminal. By signing that specific legal document, he was officially claiming ownership of a commercial property he did not possess. He was legally authorizing the sale of stolen assets across state lines. He was committing textbook wire fraud, grand larceny, and federal real estate fraud all in one single arrogant stroke of a pen. He was binding himself to a $20 million lie and completely exposing himself to the absolute maximum penalties of the federal justice system. As Marcus handed the documents back, a tight, satisfied smile spread across Brad's face. But behind that smile, Brad was already executing a devastating betrayal of his own. There is absolutely no honor among thieves, and Brad had no intention of sharing a single dime of that $20 million with his wife's family. He looked at Marcus and saw a bloated trust fund baby who was drowning in high-interest debt and drowning in his mother's vanity. Brad had hidden a maze of toxic clauses deep within the annexes of that very contract. Brad's secret plan was beautifully ruthless. Once the land title cleared, he was going to trigger a corporate restructuring loophole. The $20 million would not go into Marcus's accounts. It would be legally intercepted and locked inside an impenetrable escrow account, managed exclusively by Brad's offshore parent conglomerate. Brad was going to trap Marcus in years of suffocating corporate litigation, bleeding the family dry until they were forced to declare bankruptcy. He planned to take the land, take the money, and leave his brother-in-law completely ruined. He was going to use this deal to elevate his own status within his conglomerate, stepping over Marcus's financial corpse to secure his own promotion. Brad raised his glass, hiding his absolute disdain behind a mask of brotherly solidarity. The bartender approached their secluded table, carrying a tray holding a bottle of exceptionally rare vintage cognac. Brad had ordered it specifically for this moment, charging it directly to his corporate expense account. The amber liquid was poured into heavy crystal snifters. The two men picked up their glasses, the ice clinking softly in the dim, smoky room. Brad raised his glass high and offered a toast to loyalty to brotherhood and to the absolute uncompromising power of their elite family. Marcus eagerly clinked his glass against Brad's, echoing the toast to their impending wealth and their brilliant, untouchable success. They laughed together, a pair of predators, celebrating a feast they would never actually eat. They were two arrogant men standing on the deck of a sinking ship, toasting to the beauty of the ocean. As the cognac burned down their throats, Brad suggested that a deal of this magnificent magnitude deserved a proper public stage. He told Marcus that finalizing a $20 million corporate buyout in a smoky back room was simply not enough. The city needed to see their triumph. The local elite needed to witness the dawn of Marcus's new empire. Brad proposed that they execute the final binding contracts and present the official transfer deeds publicly. Marcus's eyes lit up at the prospect of public adoration. He immediately agreed, suggesting the perfect venue. The annual New Year's Eve gala was only a few days away. It was the absolute pinnacle of the city's high society social calendar. Vivian was already scheduled to be the guest of honor, and all of their wealthy country club associates would be in attendance. Marcus declared that they would finalize the transaction right there, in the glittering ballroom, surrounded by the press and their envious peers. He wanted to look out over the crowd of local politicians and business leaders and prove once and for all that he was a king. They shook hands on it, sealing their fraudulent pact in the dim light of the cigar lounge. They were so consumed by their mutual greed and their separate betrayals that they were completely blind to the reality closing in around them. They thought the New Year's Eve gala would be their ultimate coronation. They had no idea it was actually scheduled to be their public execution. The Oak Ridge New Year's Eve gala was not merely a party. It was the absolute undisputed pinnacle of the local social calendar. To secure a table in the grand ballroom of the historic Beaumont Hotel required either generational wealth or a level of political influence that could not be bought. For Vivian, it was the ultimate stage. She had spent weeks maneuvering, manipulating, and cashing in every remaining social favor she possessed to ensure that she and Marcus were positioned as the absolute guests of honor. They were to be seated at the center table directly beneath the massive crystal chandelier, broadcasting their fabricated triumph to the entire city. Vivian needed this night to cement her narrative. She needed the Oak Ridge elite to see Marcus as a newly liberated titan, and Chloe as his rightful high society queen. The organizers of the gala had been buzzing with a frantic, panicked energy all morning. A courier had arrived at the Beaumont Hotel carrying a heavy, wax-sealed envelope. It contained a formal RSVP for the single remaining VIP table on the elevated terrace overlooking the ballroom. The reservation was not made under a personal name. It simply listed the guest as the Chief Executive Officer of the Delaware-based holding, LLC. It was the exact same shadowy corporate entity that owned the prime commercial real estate beneath Marcus's dealership. The exact same entity Brad was attempting to orchestrate a fraudulent $20 million buyout with. When the gala's event coordinator leaked this highly confidential information to Vivian, she immediately called Marcus. The news hit Marcus and Brad like a shot of pure, uncut adrenaline. They were completely ecstatic. In their boundless, echoing arrogance, they interpreted this RSVP as a definitive confirmation of their impending wealth. They assumed the faceless out-of-state billionaire landlord had caught wind of the massive corporate buyout and was flying in to personally bless the transaction. Marcus paced around his showroom grinning like a lottery winner. He told Brad that the landlord was probably coming to publicly concede defeat to shake hands with the new titans of Oak Ridge and hand over the keys to the kingdom. Brad, being the calculating predator he was, saw an even greater opportunity. He planned to corner this mysterious CEO at the gala, buy him a glass of scotch, and establish a direct connection for future corporate takeovers. They believed the universe was finally bowing to their inherent greatness. They spent the entire afternoon adjusting their custom tuxedos, booking luxury limousines, and practicing the patronizing smiles they planned to flash when they signed the final fraudulent documents under the flash of society cameras. While Marcus and Vivian were busy measuring curtains for a castle they would never own. I was standing in the master suite of my father's house preparing for war. For 3 years I had deliberately minimized myself. I had willingly worn the heavy, exhausting uniform of a tired, invisible working mother. I had tied my hair back, worn sensible flats, and kept my head down to appease Marcus's fragile ego and avoid Vivian's relentless toxic scrutiny. I had intentionally muted my own light so that my husband could pretend he was the sun. I had allowed them to mock my background, my career, and my presence. That version of me, the compliant, quiet logistics director who swallowed insults to keep the peace, had died exactly a week ago in a freezing blizzard. Tonight required a completely different aesthetic. Tonight I was not a discarded wife begging for scraps of respect. I was the executioner. My father had called in a private styling team who understood the assignment required absolute discretion and devastating glamour. They worked in quiet, focused efficiency. My hair, usually pulled into a severe corporate bun, was let down and styled into thick, cascading waves that framed my face perfectly. The makeup was immaculate, sharp, and striking, highlighting my dark skin and emphasizing the fierce, uncompromising angle of my jaw. It was a face designed to command a corporate boardroom and terrify a liar. It was the face of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. But the true masterpiece was the gown. I had commissioned it months ago for a charity event. Marcus had ultimately refused to attend, claiming I would just embarrass him in front of his refined peers. I stepped into the heavy silk fabric and let it fall into place. It was a breathtaking custom-tailored creation in a deep saturated emerald green, the color of money and the color of poison. The silk clung to my curves with structural precision, draping perfectly down to the floor with a dangerous, elegant slit. The bodice was structured like modern armor, rigid and flawless, leaving my shoulders bare and projecting absolute authority. I paired it with towering stiletto heels and a single dramatic diamond necklace I had purchased with my first major investment dividend. I looked in the full-length mirror, and the woman staring back at me was a stranger to the Oakridge elite. She was wealthy, she was powerful, and she was utterly untouchable. I walked quietly down the hall to the guest room where Zuri was fast asleep. The soft glow of her nightlight illuminated her peaceful face. She was completely safe, completely unaware of the absolute chaos her father had attempted to unleash upon her life. I leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her warm forehead, inhaling the sweet scent of her baby shampoo. I promised her silently that she would never have to witness her mother shrink herself for the comfort of a weak man ever again. I promised her that the empire I was about to reclaim would be her true legacy. My father was standing in the doorway watching us. Darius wore a dark tailored suit, looking every bit the formidable patriarch he was. He stepped forward and placed his hands on my shoulders. He did not offer any empty platitudes or anxious warnings. He looked at the emerald gown, the flawless makeup, and the cold determination in my eyes. He simply nodded, a slow, steady gesture of absolute approval. He told me that my grandfather would have been unspeakably proud of the fortress I had built. He told me to go to the ballroom to take back my name and to leave no survivors. I walked out into the foyer and picked up the final piece of my ensemble. It was not a designer clutch or a jeweled evening bag. It was a sleek black matte leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase rested the financial nuclear weapon Elias had drafted the day before, the unchallengeable 24-hour eviction notice, the asset seizure mandate demanding the immediate surrender of their entire luxury inventory, the original commercial deed proving my absolute ownership of the land Marcus was attempting to sell, and the federal tax evasion packet Darius had meticulously compiled. The heavy oak front door opened to reveal the crisp, biting winter night. A private black car was already idling in the driveway, the exhaust pluming in the freezing air. The driver stepped out and held the door open. I slid into the leather interior, placing the briefcase gently on the seat beside me. The engine hummed as we pulled away from the safe, quiet sanctuary of my father's house and headed toward the glittering lights of downtown. Marcus, Brad, and Vivian were currently surrounded by champagne and sycophants waiting for a faceless landlord to arrive and crown them kings. They had absolutely no idea that the landlord was currently sitting in the back of a town car wearing emerald silk and bringing a guillotine to their party. The grand ballroom of the Beaumont Hotel was a suffocating display of manufactured royalty. The air was thick with the scent of imported orchids, expensive perfumes, and the sharp metallic tang of unearned arrogance. A 12-piece string quartet played softly from a raised velvet dais, their music barely masking the loud, boastful laughter of the Oakridge elite. At the absolute epicenter of this glittering circus stood Vivian. She was holding court beneath the massive central chandelier, practically radiating toxic validation. She wore a heavy, ostentatious silver gown and was dripping in diamonds that I knew for a fact were heavily financed through a predatory private lender. She was basking in the glow of the morning's successful smear campaign, accepting fawning compliments from city council members and legacy business owners who had tuned in to watch her publicly assassinate my character just hours earlier. A few feet away from Vivian's inner circle, Marcus and Chloe were orchestrating a sickeningly perfect performance for the hired society photographers. Marcus had his chest puffed out in his custom tuxedo, projecting the illusion of a newly liberated titan of industry. Chloe was clinging tightly to his arm, deliberately positioning the stolen Birkin bag toward the flashing camera lenses. She wore a smug, vacuous smile, completely absorbed in her delusion of high society integration. Marcus, meanwhile, kept throwing anxious, eager glances toward the grand entrance and the roped-off VIP terrace. He was practically vibrating with greed, desperately waiting for the mysterious corporate CEO to arrive and finalize his fraudulent $20 million coronation. Brad lingered near the champagne tower, checking his expensive watch, his predatory eyes scanning the room for the mark he planned to betray. They were completely intoxicated by their own fabricated reality. Then the heavy gilded double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were pulled open by two white-gloved ushers. The heavy brass handles clanged softly against the marble walls, a sound that somehow cut cleanly through the dull roar of the party. I stepped over the threshold and into the blinding light of the ballroom. I did not hesitate. I did not shrink. The emerald green silk of my custom gown flowed around me like liquid armor, the deep saturated color standing out violently against the sea of safe muted pastels worn by the local socialites. The towering stilettos clicked sharply against the polished marble floor with a slow, deliberate, and uncompromising rhythm. In my left hand, I carried the sleek, matte black leather briefcase. It was the only accessory I needed. The reaction of the room was instantaneous and cinematic. The boastful laughter closest to the doors faltered and died. The silence spread outward like a physical shockwave, rippling through the crowd until the entire ballroom went dead silent. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased. The low murmur of political gossip evaporated. Even the string quartet seemed to lose their rhythm, the cellist missing a note as heads turned to stare. The Oak Ridge elite, the very people who had watched Vivian mock my working-class roots and my dark skin on a live stream that morning, parted before me like the Red Sea. They had expected a broken, humiliated woman hiding in the shadows. Instead, they were staring at an apex predator. Marcus froze mid-pose. The camera flash illuminated the sudden, terrified confusion crashing across his face. Chloe's practiced smile vanished instantly, her grip on the Birkin bag tightening until her knuckles turned white. Brad stopped mid-sip, his whiskey glass hovering near his mouth as his eyes narrowed in calculating confusion. But Vivian's reaction was entirely visceral, her meticulously lifted face contorted into an ugly, rigid mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. She could not comprehend what she was seeing. She had personally instructed the security detail at the front doors to reject my name under any circumstances. She had intended for me to spend New Year's Eve weeping in my father's kitchen. Seeing me standing in the center of her exclusive sanctuary, radiating absolute power and looking utterly untouchable, completely short-circuited her brain. Vivian slammed her crystal champagne flute down onto a passing waiter's tray with a sharp, violent clink. She broke away from her circle of sycophants and marched across the open marble floor directly toward me. Her silver gown swept aggressively behind her. Lauren and Chloe immediately fell into step, rushing to flank her. They formed a pathetic, venomous triad, their faces twisting into identical sneers of superiority. They thought I had come to cause a desperate emotional scene. They genuinely believed I had crashed the most exclusive event of the year to beg for my husband back or to cry over a stolen handbag. They were fully preparing to humiliate me in front of every judge, politician, and socialite in the city. Vivian stopped 3 feet in front of me, forcing me to halt my advance. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of venom and absolute disbelief. She practically spat her words, ensuring her voice carried across the silent watching room. She demanded to know how the help had managed to sneak past the security desk. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh, looking back at Lauren and Chloe for validation. Lauren snickered loudly, crossing her arms over her chest, while Chloe stepped forward, adjusting her posture to ensure the Birkin bag was fully visible, a silent, petty taunt meant to break my composure. Vivian turned back to me, her voice dripping with toxic condescension. She told me I was embarrassing myself. She told me the catering entrance was in the back alley, and that if I did not turn around and walk out the door immediately, she would have me physically dragged out by the guards. She stood there, flanked by her accomplices, waiting for me to shatter. They were ready for a public execution, completely unaware that they had just placed their own heads on the chopping block. Before Vivian could unleash another volley of toxic insults, Marcus decided it was his time to shine. He stepped out from the shadow of the chandelier, adjusting the cuffs of his custom tuxedo with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrists. He positioned himself squarely in front of Vivian, adopting the posture of a formidable, commanding patriarch protecting his realm. To anyone who did not know him, he might have looked like a man in total control, but I knew every single one of his tells. I saw the slight tremor in his fingers, the rapid pulsing of a vein in his neck, and the frantic, panicked glint behind his eyes. He was terrified, but his fragile ego, surrounded by his peers and the flashing cameras, demanded a performance. Marcus looked down at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure condescending pity. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of faux concern that was designed to make me look completely unhinged. He told me that this was truly pathetic. He sighed heavily, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a deeply disturbed child. He addressed the silent ballroom, declaring that he understood breakups were difficult, but that this level of desperation was simply unacceptable. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper meant only for my ears. He ordered me to turn around and walk out the doors right that second. He told me that if I did not leave the premises immediately, he would personally have me arrested for trespassing and ensure that the resulting scandal permanently destroyed whatever miserable life I had left. Chloe seized the opportunity to pile on. She stepped out from behind Marcus, clutching my stolen Birkin bag like a shield. She let out a soft, mocking sigh and whispered loud enough for the front row of guests to hear that it was honestly tragic to see a woman so incapable of moving on. She leaned against Marcus's arm, gazing up at him with wide, innocent eyes, playing the role of the harassed victim to absolute perfection. The sheer audacity of the display would have broken me a year ago. A week ago, it might have made me scream. But tonight I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical anticipation. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not offer them a single word of response. My silence only infuriated them further. Marcus's face began to flush a deep, angry red. His illusion of control was slipping because the script he had written in his head required me to beg, cry, or shout. My absolute stillness was short-circuiting his performance. Seeing Marcus falter, Brad smoothly glided into the fray. Brad was a different breed of predator. He did not care about ego, he cared about optics and execution. He recognized immediately that my presence here in a custom gown carrying a briefcase was a massive, terrifying anomaly that threatened his $20 million corporate scheme. He needed me removed swiftly and brutally before I could open my mouth. Brad raised his hand and snapped his fingers, a sharp, commanding sound that echoed through the tense ballroom. He flagged down the Beaumont Hotel's head of security, a burly man in a dark suit accompanied by the gala's frantic event director. Brad did not whisper. He projected his voice with the calculated precision of a seasoned litigator, ensuring that every wealthy investor, politician, and journalist in the room heard his exact narrative. He pointed a long, manicured finger directly at my chest. He loudly proclaimed to the event director that there had been a catastrophic breach in their security protocol. He declared that an uninvited, deranged ex-wife was actively harassing his family and disrupting the most important social event of the year. He spun a masterful, malicious lie stating that I had a history of severe mental instability and that I was currently having a dangerous public breakdown. Brad demanded that the security team detain me, immediately confiscate my briefcase, and drag me out through the service elevator so as not to further distress the paying guests. He threatened the event director with a massive lawsuit if I was not removed from the property within 60 seconds. The effect on the crowd was immediate. The murmurs began. It started as a low, buzzing whisper that rapidly swelled into a cacophony of judgment. The Oak Ridge elite thrive on scandal, and they were eating this up. I could hear the hushed gasps, the snide comments, and the cruel, quiet laughter. Women in expensive gowns leaned into their husbands, whispering about my supposed mental breakdown. Men in tuxedos shook their heads, muttering about the tragic desperation of a discarded woman. They were all waiting for the inevitable climax. They expected the security guards to grab my arms. They expected me to drop my briefcase, fall to my knees, and dissolve into a puddle of humiliating, hysterical tears. They expected to watch a broken woman be dragged out into the freezing night, completely ruined. The head of security, flanked by two massive guards, approached me with heavy, hurried steps. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a set of zip ties, clearly preparing to handle me as a hostile trespasser. He ordered me to step away from the guests and place my hands where he could see them. Vivian let out a sharp, victorious bark of laughter. Marcus crossed his arms, a smug, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. Chloe openly grinned, tightening her grip on the Birkin bag. I still did not speak. I did not back away. I simply shifted my weight slightly, adjusting my grip on the matte, black leather briefcase. I raised my left wrist, allowing the heavy diamond watch to catch the light of the crystal chandelier overhead. I stared at the face of the watch, watching the sweeping second hand with absolute, unbroken focus. I was not looking at Marcus. I was not looking at Vivian or Brad or the security guards closing in around me. I was simply waiting. I knew the exact schedule of this execution. I had synchronized this moment with Darius and his legal team down to the very last fraction of a second. I watched the slender gold hand of the watch tick closer and closer to the top of the hour. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. 3 seconds. The head of security reached out his heavy hand, closing around my bare shoulder. Vivian smiled, ready to watch me fall. Exactly as the heavy hand of the head of security clamped down on my bare shoulder, a sharp, piercing ring erupted from the event director's pocket. The jarring electronic sound cut violently through the hushed, tense atmosphere of the ballroom. The event director snatched the phone from his tuxedo jacket, his eyes widening frantically as he read the urgent, high-priority text message flashing across his illuminated screen. He looked from his glowing phone up to my face, and all the color instantly drained from his previously flushed cheeks. He lunged forward with a sudden, desperate burst of energy, grabbing the head of security by the wrist and frantically yanking the man's heavy hand off my shoulder. The burly guard looked bewildered, his brow furrowing as he prepared to argue the sudden change in protocol. But the event director shook his head with a frantic, terrified intensity, silently begging the guard to stand down. To the absolute shock of Vivian, Marcus, and every single person watching, the event director took a rapid step back, smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo with shaking hands, and offered me a deep, trembling bow. The head of security, realizing the immense gravity of the silent command, instantly mirrored the gesture, dropping his aggressive, hostile posture and bowing his head in profound, unquestioning respect. Vivian's victorious, cruel smile completely collapsed. She took a stumbling, uncoordinated step forward, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no sound emerged from her throat. Marcus looked rapidly back and forth between the bowing guards and my utterly impassive face, his brain visibly struggling and failing to process the impossible visual unfolding in front of him. Before any of them could find their voices to demand an explanation, a crisp, authoritative voice cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. It was Elias. My lead corporate attorney strode confidently through the parted crowd of local socialites, looking sharp, ruthless, and entirely in his element. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit and carried a thick leather folder tucked securely under his arm. His polished shoes clicked in perfect measured rhythm as he bypassed Vivian entirely, completely ignoring her existence, and took his rightful place directly at my right side. Elias turned to face the bewildered, hushed elite of Oakridge. He did not yell, but his voice was expertly projected, designed to bounce off the high vaulted ceilings and command absolute, unyielding authority. He introduced himself clearly and firmly as the senior legal counsel representing the Delaware-based Holding LLC. He announced to the captive audience that he was here to formally correct a rather pathetic and highly embarrassing misunderstanding regarding the evening's VIP guest list. He swept his arm gracefully toward me, his voice ringing out clear, steady, and devastating. He officially introduced me to the entire glittering ballroom as the chief executive officer, the primary shareholder, and the sole undisputed owner of the commercial holding company. The collective gasp that sucked the oxygen out of the grand ballroom was absolutely deafening. It was a physical, tangible wave of shock that washed over the massive crowd of politicians, investors, and legacy socialites. The whispering erupted instantly, a chaotic, frantic buzz of realization as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together in the minds of the city's most powerful people. The quiet, exhausted, supposedly discarded wife of Marcus Jenkins was not a victim seeking revenge. She was the anonymous billionaire landlord they had all been speculating about for months. I turned my cold, steady gaze back to the perpetrators. The psychological devastation inflicted upon them was instant and total. Marcus looked as though he had been physically struck by a freight train. His smug smile vanished, his jaw hanging slack, and his eyes bulging out of his head as the sheer staggering magnitude of his colossal mistake finally crushed him. The arrogant, bloated confidence he had worn all evening evaporated completely, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, hollow shell of a man staring into the abyss. He finally understood that the $20 million gold mine he thought he was stealing actually belonged to the very woman he had arrogantly thrown out into the freezing snow. Beside him, Brad was experiencing a silent, catastrophic internal meltdown. The cold, calculating corporate python had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. Brad knew exactly what this introduction meant. He knew the illegal backroom contracts he had drafted, the federal wire fraud he had initiated, and the corporate treason he had orchestrated were not clever, brilliant maneuvers. They were a meticulously designed trap I had set, and he had walked his foolish brother-in-law directly into the center of it. Brad turned completely paper white, his skin taking on a sickly, translucent hue as he realized his entire lucrative career, his reputation and his freedom were effectively over. But it was Vivian who provided the most spectacular physical reaction of the night. The undeniable, crushing reality of my power shattered her fragile, fabricated world into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. The muscles in her face twitched uncontrollably as her mind broke under the weight of her humiliation. Her fingers went entirely numb. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her weak grasp and plummeted toward the floor. The sound of the thick glass shattering violently against the polished marble echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. Splinters of expensive crystal and vintage champagne splashed across the hem of her ostentatious silver gown, but she did not even blink. She just stared at me, completely paralyzed by the absolute immediate destruction of her social empire. Chloe instinctively took a rapid step back, desperately trying to hide behind Marcus's broad shoulders. Her grip on the stolen Birkin bag suddenly looked pathetic and cheap compared to the staggering, unfathomable corporate wealth standing just feet away from her. Lauren pressed her hand hard over her mouth, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit doors as if actively looking for a quick escape route. I did not give them a single moment to breathe or a fraction of a chance to recover their shattered composure. The execution had only just begun. I turned away from their terrified, bloodless faces, gripping the firm handle of my matte black briefcase. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the main stage positioned at the front of the ballroom. The massive crowd of elite guests scrambled to get out of my path, parting respectfully and watching me with a mixture of profound awe and absolute primal terror. They recognized real power when they saw it, and they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were witnessing a monumental changing of the guard in their city. I climbed the carpeted steps of the raised dais, my emerald silk gown trailing beautifully behind me like liquid royalty. The string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments, watching my ascent with wide, unblinking eyes. I walked directly to the center of the stage and stopped perfectly positioned behind the standing microphone. I placed the heavy leather briefcase onto the wooden podium, snapping the dual brass locks open with two sharp, definitive clicks that carried across the silent room. I adjusted the microphone, bringing it closer to my mouth. I looked out over the massive sea of upturned faces, locating Marcus, Vivian, and Brad, still frozen in the exact center of the room. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room was practically suffocating. It was finally time to pull the trigger. "Good evening, Oak Ridge." I began, my voice amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. It echoed with an icy, uncompromising precision that demanded absolute submission. The acoustics of the Beaumont Hotel ballroom carried every single syllable perfectly. I did not yell. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a woman who held every single card in the deck and was preparing to lay down a royal flush. I thanked the esteemed guests for attending what was billed as a celebration of Marcus Jenkins, but was in fact a public audit of his spectacular failure. The room was so quiet, you could hear the soft rustle of silk as guests leaned forward, straining to catch every devastating word. I reached into the matte black briefcase resting on the wooden podium. My fingers closed around the thick premium parchment of the original commercial deed. I pulled it out, holding it up high under the harsh glare of the stage lights. Alongside it, I produced the original lease agreement for the land beneath Marcus's luxury car dealership. I explained clearly and methodically that the ground they stood on, the ground Marcus claimed to rule, had belonged to my family for generations. I detailed how my grandfather had secured the plot, how it had been transferred to my holding company, and how Marcus had been nothing more than a glorified tenant paying heavily subsidized rent that he had recently decided to arrogantly default on. I shifted my gaze directly to Brad. The cold, calculating corporate python looked like he was about to physically be sick. I addressed him by his full title, bringing his prestigious corporate firm into the unforgiving spotlight. I asked him how a senior acquisitions director could be so profoundly incompetent as to initiate a $20 million buyout without verifying the baseline municipal property records. I revealed to the entire room that the preliminary sales contract Marcus and Brad had signed in their smoky back room earlier that week was completely null and void. I explained in excruciating legal detail that by signing those documents, they had actively conspired to sell commercial property they did not own. I used the words federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate negligence, letting the heavy criminal implications settle over the horrified crowd like a suffocating blanket. Brad staggered backward, physically retreating from the radioactive fallout of his own greed. The elite investors and politicians surrounding him immediately stepped away, treating him like a highly contagious disease. He had tried to outsmart a ghost and had instead walked his entire lucrative career straight into a federal indictment. His reputation was instantly reduced to ash. Then I turned my absolute undivided attention to Marcus, the man who had relentlessly mocked my career, who had callously drained his own daughter's college fund, and who had thrown me out into a freezing blizzard, was visibly trembling. His jaw was hanging slack, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate panic. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a weak, terrified man, permanently stripped of his unearned armor. I stepped out from behind the wooden podium. I did not rush. I walked slowly and deliberately down the carpeted stairs of the dais, closing the distance between the stage and the dead center of the ballroom. The crowd parted even further, pressing themselves against the banquet tables to give me a wide, clear path to my ex-husband. I pulled the final document from the leather folder Elias had handed me. It was printed on heavy, blindingly white paper bearing the harsh red stamp of the county courts. It was the unchallengeable 24-hour eviction mandate. I stopped mere inches away from Marcus. The scent of his expensive designer cologne was now distinctly sour, tainted with the unmistakable smell of fear sweat. I did not raise my hand to strike him. I did not need to resort to physical violence. I simply held up the eviction notice and dropped it squarely onto his chest. The heavy paper hit his custom tuxedo jacket and fluttered down to the polished marble floor, landing directly between his expensive leather shoes. I did not break eye contact as I delivered the final, devastating blow. I projected my voice, ensuring every single socialite, politician, and journalist in the room heard the exact unyielding terms of his ruin. I announced that due to months of delinquent rent and egregious breach of contract, his luxury dealership was officially seized. I informed him that the county sheriff had already been dispatched to the commercial property. I told him that the massive iron gates were currently being padlocked, the security systems were being overridden, and every single luxury vehicle on that lot would be locked down and impounded by dawn. The collective gasp from the crowd was a wave of pure social execution. To the Oak Ridge elite, poverty was a sin, but public financial ruin brought on by sheer stupidity was an unforgivable crime. Marcus had invited the entire city to witness his coronation, and instead they were watching him be stripped of his kingdom, his assets, and his dignity in real time. He tried to speak, to formulate some kind of defense or pathetic excuse, but his throat was completely dry. A harsh, desperate wheeze was the only sound he could manage to produce. Vivian, standing frozen beside him, suddenly realized the true catastrophic scope of the devastation. The dealership was gone. The land was mine. The $20 million was a phantom illusion. The crushing high-interest debt she had blindly accumulated to fund her extravagant lifestyle and this very gala was about to drown her completely. Her knees buckled, and she swayed heavily, grabbing frantically onto Lauren's arm to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. Lauren, however, violently jerked her arm away, refusing to go down with the sinking ship. Loyalty in this room only extended as far as the nearest bank account, and Vivian's accounts were officially empty. Chloe, realizing that the golden goose she had staked her future on was actually a dead duck, slowly backed away from Marcus. She tried to subtly hide the stolen Birkin bag behind her back, her face pale with the terrifying realization that she had tethered herself to a bankrupt criminal facing federal charges. She looked around the room, searching for a sympathetic face, but found only cold, disgusted glares from the women she had tried to emulate. I stood tall in the center of the devastated wreckage of their lives. I had not shed a single tear. I had not raised my voice. I had simply presented the cold, hard, uncompromising truth. I looked at Marcus one final time, memorizing the absolute despair etched into his features. I told him that his time was up, and that he had exactly 24 hours to clear his personal trash out of my building before I had it legally incinerated. The heavy gilded doors at the back of the ballroom swung open for the second time tonight. They did not creak, but the dull thud of them hitting the rubber wall stops echoed like a judge's gavel. 3 men stepped over the threshold. The man in the center was Darius, my father. He did not look like the exhausted working-class man that Vivian had mercilessly mocked on her morning live stream. He was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit that commanded immediate respect. His posture was impeccably straight, his silver hair neatly combed, and his expression carved from solid granite. He looked exactly like the apex predator of the financial world that he truly was. But it was the 2 men flanking him that caused the collective breath of the Oak Ridge elite to hitch in their throats. They were broad-shouldered and severe, wearing dark tactical windbreakers. The bold yellow lettering across their backs and the badges clipped to their belts sent a wave of primal terror through the room. FBI and IRS. The crowd, which had already parted for me, now practically climbed over each other to clear a wider path. The presence of federal agents in a room full of billionaires and politicians was like dropping a live grenade into a powder keg. Every wealthy socialite with a creative tax accountant suddenly looked violently ill. Marcus was still kneeling on the marble floor, staring blankly at the eviction notice resting by his shoes. When he finally looked up and saw the federal windbreakers approaching his face, completely drained of whatever blood it had left, Brad actually stumbled backward, his polished exterior crumbling as he collided hard with a cocktail table, sending half-empty martini glasses crashing to the floor. He recognized the specific agents. He knew exactly what division they represented, and he knew that they did not attend social galas unless they were bringing federal indictments. Darius climbed the carpeted stairs of the stage with a steady, measured pace. He did not look at the crowd. He walked directly up to me and offered a single profound nod of pride. I stepped back, yielding the center of the stage. I picked up my briefcase and moved to the side, allowing him to take the podium. Darius reached out and adjusted the microphone. He did not yell. He did not gloat or sneer or raise his voice to match the theatrical drama of the evening. Instead, he spoke with the terrifying sterile and clinical calm of a veteran forensic auditor reading a ledger. He introduced himself to the silent ballroom, simply stating his name and his title as a senior forensic investigator for the federal government. He announced that he was stepping in to clarify the financial reality of the Jenkins family and their associates. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket and pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of paper. He deliberately unfolded it, smoothing the creases flat against the wooden podium. Then he began to read. Darius methodically outlined the exact, undeniable trail of financial crimes Marcus and Brad had committed over the last 3 years. His voice was a steady, relentless drumbeat of devastation. He detailed the fabricated profit and loss statements submitted to corporate investors. He explained with excruciating precision how Marcus had siphoned massive amounts of capital directly from the dealership's operational budget to fund Vivian's lavish lifestyle. He read off specific dates and exact dollar amounts linking high-end jewelry purchases and luxury vacations directly to fraudulent corporate write-offs. He did not stop there. Darius turned his clinical gaze to Brad. He outlined the sophisticated network of shell companies Brad had established in offshore accounts to hide the embezzled funds from federal oversight. He recited the routing numbers of the fraudulent wire transfers, exposing the exact mechanics of their tax evasion scheme to the entire room of their peers. He laid bare the reality that Brad was not a brilliant legal mind, but a sloppy, arrogant criminal who had left a digital paper trail a mile wide. The meticulous breakdown of their stupidity was breathtaking. Darius even noted the exact corporate funds used to purchase the designer Birkin bag Chloe was currently clutching, proving that every symbol of status they paraded around was bought with stolen money. Chloe dropped the bag instantly, as if the leather had suddenly caught fire. She scrambled backward, her face twisted in horror, finally realizing she was entirely complicit in possessing stolen federal evidence. The precision of the exposé was agonizing. It was not a series of allegations or emotional accusations. It was a completed federal autopsy of their financial crimes presented in front of the very society they had tried to impress. I watched the crowd's reaction. The wealthy politicians and investors who had clinked glasses with Marcus just 20 minutes ago were now physically recoiling. They pulled their expensive gowns and tailored suits away from the center of the room, treating the Jenkins family like a highly contagious virus. Nobody wanted to be caught standing too close to the epicenter of a massive federal takedown. Brad was sweating profusely. He was hyperventilating, his legal mind rapidly calculating the decades of mandatory minimum federal prison time attached to each specific statute Darius casually listed off. Aggravated wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, willful tax evasion. Brad grabbed his chest, looking desperately toward the exit, but the 2 federal agents had already moved to block the main doors, effectively sealing the trap. Marcus was weeping openly now, a pathetic broken sound that echoed through the quiet room. He buried his face in his hands, entirely consumed by the reality of his total destruction. Darius looked up from his single sheet of paper. His eyes swept over Marcus, Brad, and Vivian. His voice dropped an octave, striking the final fatal chord of the evening. He announced that as of 8 o'clock tonight, federal warrants had been officially executed across the state. He declared that the Internal Revenue Service, operating in tandem with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had officially frozen every single bank account, investment portfolio, and line of credit associated with the Jenkins family and Brad's legal firm. Vivian let out a strangled, hysterical gasp. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at Darius, screaming that he was lying and that he was just a pathetic, bitter old man trying to ruin her son. Darius did not even blink. He looked directly at Vivian, who was currently gripping the edge of a table to keep from falling. He informed her in a voice devoid of any pity that the black luxury credit cards in her designer purse were currently useless pieces of plastic. He announced that the extravagant suburban mansion she had used as her personal kingdom was subject to immediate federal seizure and that she was officially entirely bankrupt. He stated that the vehicles they drove here tonight would be impounded by midnight, and that they would likely need to find a public bus to get back to whatever cheap motel would accept cash from a family currently under federal investigation. Every single cent of their fake manufactured wealth had just been evaporated into thin air. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of lies, greed, and stolen money. Now the federal government had stepped in to pull the foundation completely out from under them, leaving them with absolutely nothing. The heavy silence following Darius's proclamation was suddenly shattered by a sharp, aggressive vibration. It was coming from Brad's inner jacket pocket. The sleek corporate attorney who had strutted through the ballroom with the arrogance of a kingmaker now looked like a cornered rat. His hand shook violently as he reached inside his tailored suit, pulling out his custom smartphone. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim light of the ballroom. It was the chief executive officer of his parent conglomerate in New York. Darius watched the phone screen from his position on the stage and offered a cold, knowing smile. He adjusted his cuffs and spoke calmly into the microphone, explaining to the bewildered crowd that federal investigators were legally obligated to notify parent corporations when a senior director was formally implicated in a multi-million-dollar wire fraud conspiracy. Darius had personally sent the heavily documented federal dossier directly to the CEO's desk just 30 minutes prior. He had ensured that the corporate guillotine would fall at the exact moment Brad felt most untouchable. Brad stared at the ringing phone as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He knew exactly what that phone call meant. He had spent his entire adult life clawing his way up the vicious corporate ladder, stepping on anyone and everyone to secure his exorbitant salary, his prestige, and his massive golden parachute. Now that parachute was completely on fire. He swiped the screen with a trembling thumb and lifted the phone to his ear, his face completely devoid of color. The voice on the other end was loud enough that even the guests standing a few feet away could clearly hear the furious, muffled shouting. Brad did not even have the chance to offer a greeting or formulate a pathetic excuse. He was being verbally decimated by the most powerful man in his corporate universe. The CEO informed Brad that he was terminated effective immediately. He announced that corporate security was currently clearing out his corner office, packing his personal effects into cardboard boxes and throwing them into the street. But the true fatal blow was the stock options. The CEO declared that due to the severe criminal breach of his executive contract and the catastrophic liability he had brought to the firm, every single unvested stock option, every projected bonus, and every ounce of corporate equity Brad had accumulated over his decade-long career was instantly and permanently voided. The firm was legally severing all ties and throwing him directly to the federal wolves. Brad lowered the phone, his arm dropping to his side like dead weight. The expensive device slipped from his sweaty fingers and clattered loudly onto the marble floor. His perfectly styled hair was now plastered to his forehead with cold, terrified sweat. The impeccable white knight brother-in-law, the man who had looked down on my working-class background with absolute sneering disdain, was completely and utterly ruined. He was no longer a wealthy senior partner pulling the strings of Oak Ridge society. He was a broke, disgraced, and publicly terminated criminal actively facing a federal indictment. The chilling realization of Brad's total annihilation washed over Lauren. She had built her entire identity around her husband's corporate status. She had paraded around Oak Ridge for years, bragging about their offshore accounts, their luxury cars, and their supposedly untouchable wealth. She had actively conspired with Vivian and Chloe to destroy me simply because she believed her money made her superior. But the money was officially gone. The status was gone. She was now legally bound to a man who was about to trade his tailored tuxedo for a federal prison jumpsuit. Lauren's reaction was instantaneous and entirely feral. The mask of the poised, sophisticated socialite melted away, revealing the shallow, vicious opportunist underneath. She turned on Brad like a rabid dog. She did not care about the hundreds of elite guests watching her. She did not care about dignity, decorum, or family loyalty. She lunged at him, her hands curled into claws, screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid. Her voice was shrill and hysterical, echoing painfully off the vaulted ceilings of the Beaumont Hotel. She shrieked that he had promised her total financial security. He had promised her millions from the dealership buyout. She violently shoved him hard in the chest, her expensive diamond bracelets flashing under the chandeliers as she struck him. She yelled that he had dragged her into a federal investigation and completely destroyed her perfect life. She told him that she would never spend a single day in a courtroom standing behind a pathetic, broke failure. Brad was too paralyzed by shock to even defend himself against his wife. He stumbled backward under the physical force of her assault, raising his hands in a weak, pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged her to lower her voice, pleading with her to keep quiet so they could formulate a legal strategy. He mumbled desperately about finding a loophole, about negotiating a plea deal, about calling in favors from old judges. But Lauren was not listening. She was absolutely hysterical, consumed by the terrifying reality that her platinum credit cards were frozen and her social standing was permanently eradicated. She slapped his hands away, spitting venomous insults directly into his face. She called him a fraud, a coward, and a massive disappointment. She screamed that she was filing for divorce the absolute second the sun came up, and that she would gladly testify against him in federal court if it meant saving herself from going to prison. The perfect high society couple was publicly tearing each other apart, trading their manufactured loyalty for desperate, selfish preservation. The Oakridge elite watched the grotesque spectacle with absolute revulsion. The very people Lauren had desperately tried to impress were now actively stepping away from her, whispering their disgust and shielding their eyes. The entire ballroom witnessed the ugly, hollow core of the Jenkins extended family. They had possessed no real bond, no actual love, and no genuine loyalty. Their entire existence was glued together by stolen money and a shared toxic arrogance. The exact moment the money evaporated, they turned on each other with the ruthless brutality of starving animals. Brad stood in the center of the carnage, completely isolated and broken. The federal agents watched him with cold, professional indifference, ready to move in and make the arrest. His career was ash. His finances were seized. His wife was publicly abandoning him to save her own skin. The monumental greed that had driven him to orchestrate my ruin had instead engineered his own flawless, spectacular destruction. He wiped a trembling hand across his sweaty face, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The walls of the ballroom were closing in on him, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. While Brad hyperventilated in the center of the ballroom, Vivian remained frozen near the edge of the stage. The crushing gravity of Darius's federal mandate was finally piercing through her thick layers of lifelong delusion. Her sprawling suburban estate was gone. Her offshore accounts were frozen. Her platinum credit cards were absolutely worthless. The carefully curated reality she had maintained for decades, the reality that dictated she was the undisputed queen of Oakridge society, had just been shattered into a million jagged pieces. She looked down at her custom designer gown and the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, suddenly realizing that she was wearing stolen federal evidence. A horrifying choking sound escaped her throat. She was a woman who defined her entire existence by her proximity to wealth and power. Poverty was not just a fear for Vivian, it was a fate worse than death. And now she was staring down the barrel of total, absolute destitution. Panic completely overrode her usual icy composure. Vivian spun around, frantically searching the sea of stunned faces for a lifeline. Her eyes locked onto a cluster of women standing near the grand ice sculpture. These were the elite matriarchs of the Oakridge Country Club, the women Vivian played tennis with, hosted charity luncheons with, and aggressively gossiped with every single weekend. They were her inner circle, her loyal subjects. Vivian practically lunged toward them, her arms outstretched, tears ruining her expensive makeup. She cried out to them by name, begging them to intervene. She pleaded with Beatrice and Eleanor, demanding that they vouch for her character, insisting that this was all a massive misunderstanding and a vicious lie perpetrated by my jealous father. She reached out her manicured hand, expecting them to pull her to safety and shield her from the nightmare unfolding around her. But the matriarchs of Oakridge did not reach back. Instead, they moved in perfect, terrifying unison, physically stepping away from Vivian, as if she were radiating a deadly toxin. Beatrice, the president of the country club, lifted her chin and looked down her nose at Vivian with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She simply turned her back. The rest of the women immediately followed suit, closing their ranks and completely shutting Vivian out. The whispers began instantly. I could hear their sharp, venomous voices cutting through the silence of the ballroom. They called her a fraud, a criminal, and a pathetic grifter. They openly mocked her fake wealth and discussed how quickly they would vote to revoke her country club membership. Loyalty in their world was entirely transactional, and Vivian's accounts were permanently empty. Vivian stood there, her arms still outstretched, completely paralyzed by the brutal social execution. She was officially a pariah. The very society she had worshipped her entire life was rejecting her with a vicious surgical precision. She was no longer Vivian Jenkins, the wealthy socialite. She was the mother of a federal criminal, a woman facing imminent homelessness, and a disgraced outcast. The shock was too much for her fragile ego to bear. Her knees finally gave out. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor, her designer gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, not out of remorse for her actions, but out of pure, unadulterated self-pity. Her kingdom was gone, and she was entirely alone in the wreckage. While Vivian crumbled, Chloe was having a terrifying epiphany of her own. The mistress had stood frozen near the banquet tables, watching the entire federal takedown with wide, panicked eyes. She had staked her entire youth and beauty on Marcus Jenkins. She had gleefully helped him destroy our marriage because he had promised her a life of limitless luxury, endless shopping sprees, and guaranteed high society status. But Darius had just laid out the brutal clinical truth. There was no $20 million buyout. The dealership was seized. The luxury cars were impounded. The Birkin bag she had proudly paraded around all night was purchased with embezzled corporate funds. She was currently dating a broke, disgraced man who was about to be indicted on multiple federal fraud charges. Chloe looked at Marcus. He was still kneeling on the floor, a weeping, pathetic shell of the arrogant man she thought she had conquered. He offered no security, no wealth, and absolutely no future. The glamorous fantasy she had bought into had instantly morphed into a terrifying legal nightmare. Her survival instincts kicked in with ruthless efficiency. She looked down at her left hand, where a massive, flashy diamond engagement ring sparkled under the chandeliers. Marcus had given it to her just last week, promising her a lavish destination wedding in front of all his wealthy friends. Now that ring was nothing more than a piece of stolen property that the FBI would undoubtedly be seizing by morning. Chloe violently ripped the diamond ring off her finger. She did not hesitate. She marched directly over to where Marcus was kneeling on the floor. He looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen, desperately reaching out his hand to seek comfort from his beautiful bride-to-be. He choked out her name, begging her to tell him everything would be okay. Instead of offering comfort, Chloe reared back and delivered a vicious, ringing slap directly across his face. The sound echoed sharply, snapping Marcus's head to the side. She threw the heavy diamond ring squarely at his chest. It bounced off his tear-stained tuxedo shirt and clattered onto the marble floor, rolling away to join the discarded eviction notice. She leaned down and hissed at him, her voice filled with pure, venomous contempt. She told him that he was a pathetic, broke liar and that she would absolutely never visit him in federal prison. She spat at his feet, declaring that she was entirely done with him. Chloe did not waste another second. She spun around on her designer heels and marched straight across the ballroom. She locked eyes with a young, arrogant club promoter who had been aggressively pursuing her for months, a man Marcus deeply despised. She linked her arm through his, flashing him a brilliant, calculated smile, and completely ignored the chaos unfolding behind her. The promoter smirked, wrapping his arm around her waist, and happily escorting her out of the double doors, abandoning the Jenkins family to their federal fate. Marcus was left kneeling entirely alone in the center of the devastated ballroom. His business partner was ruined. His mother was sobbing on the floor, an outcast from her own society. His brother-in-law was facing a divorce and federal charges, and his mistress had just publicly humiliated him before leaving with his rival. He had absolutely no one left. The empire he thought he ruled was a complete illusion, and the cold, unforgiving reality of a federal prison cell was the only future he had left to look forward to. I stood next to Darius on the stage watching the total annihilation of the people who had tried to destroy me, and I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, settling peace. The silence that followed Chloe's dramatic exit was heavy and suffocating. Marcus remained on his knees in the center of the ballroom, completely paralyzed by the sheer velocity of his downfall. He slowly turned his head, looking at the spot where his mother was still weeping on the marble floor. He looked at Brad, who was currently being flanked by federal agents, his corporate career reduced to ash. He looked at the double doors where his mistress had just vanished with his rival. The entire illusion of his invincibility had been violently stripped away, leaving nothing but a hollow, terrified core. Then his bloodshot eyes locked onto me. I stood on the stage beside my father, perfectly composed, entirely untouched by the wreckage. As Marcus stared up at me, I saw the exact moment his delusion broke. He finally understood that he possessed absolutely no leverage, no money, no power, and no escape. I was his absolute last and only hope. He did not stand up. Instead, he did something so profoundly pathetic that a collective gasp rippled through the remaining guests. Marcus began to shuffle forward on his knees, dragging his custom-tailored trousers across the polished marble floor. He crawled toward the base of the stage, his hands clasped tightly together in front of his chest like a man praying for salvation. Sweat and tears stained his face, turning his skin a blotchy, sickly red. The expensive designer cologne he wore was entirely overpowered by the sour stench of pure panic. He stopped at the bottom of the carpeted stairs, craning his neck to look up at me. He opened his mouth, but a wet, desperate sob tore from his throat before he could form a word. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was a frantic, trembling wheeze. He begged me for mercy. He choked out my name, Kiara, crying that he was so incredibly sorry. He pleaded with me to talk to Darius to call off the federal agents to tear up the eviction notice and make the nightmare stop. He swore that he would do anything I asked, that he would sign over the business, that he would go to rehab, that he would be the man I always wanted him to be. He frantically grabbed the edge of the stage, pulling himself up slightly. He invoked our wedding vows, crying that we had promised to stay together for better or for worse. He tried to frame his years of financial abuse, his relentless emotional cruelty, and his blatant infidelity as a simple mistake. He claimed that the stress of the business had broken him, that he had been led astray by Brad's bad advice and Chloe's manipulation. He refused to take an ounce of genuine responsibility, desperately trying to cast himself as a confused victim who had merely stumbled off the path. I stood perfectly still, watching him unravel. I did not soften. I did not flinch. My expression remained locked in a mask of absolute freezing indifference. When Marcus realized that his apologies were bouncing off me like hail against bulletproof glass, his desperation shifted into something far more vile. He reached for the ultimate weapon. He weaponized our child. Tears poured down his cheeks as he loudly invoked Zuri's name. He manipulated his voice, trying to sound like a heartbroken, devoted family man. He cried that I could not do this to our family. He begged me to think of our innocent little girl. He sobbed that Zuri needed her father, that she would be permanently traumatized if I allowed the federal government to send her daddy to a maximum security prison. He clasped his hands tighter, pleading with me to give him a second chance, strictly for the sake of our daughter. He swore on his life that he would be a perfect father if I just showed him a shred of mercy. The sheer audacity of his manipulation sent a shockwave of disgust through the ballroom. Even the most hardened corporate sharks in the crowd recoiled at the sight of a grown man hiding behind a child to escape a federal fraud indictment. I did not need to raise my voice to cut through his pathetic display. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance until I was towering directly over him. The overhead stage lights caught the cold calculation in my eyes. I looked down at the weeping, trembling mess of a man I had once promised to love and felt nothing but absolute zero empathy. I spoke with a voice so sharp and icy, it practically lowered the temperature of the room. I told him never to speak my daughter's name again. I projected my words, ensuring every single person in the ballroom heard the undeniable truth of his so-called fatherhood. I reminded him that a real father does not methodically drain his own child's college fund to buy $20,000 handbags for a 22-year-old mistress. A real father does not siphon the financial security of his family to fund an illegal corporate Ponzi scheme. Marcus flinched, physically shrinking away from the unyielding reality of my words. He tried to interrupt to formulate another weak excuse, but I cut him off instantly. I reminded him of the exact night he had finalized his betrayal. I detailed how he had callously thrown me and Zuri out of our own home. I described the freezing blizzard, the biting wind, and the absolute terror of being cast into the street with absolutely nothing, while he sat inside drinking expensive scotch and laughing with his mistress. I made sure the entire Oakridge elite understood exactly the kind of monster that was currently begging at my feet. I stepped down onto the first stair, bringing my face closer to his. I delivered the final, devastating, calculated rejection. My voice was a lethal, uncompromising weapon. You aren't a father, Marcus. You're just a squatter who picked the wrong woman to cross. My daughter and I are leaving you in the snow. The words struck him with the kinetic force of a freight train. The last flickering ember of hope in his eyes was instantly extinguished, leaving behind a hollow, vacant stare of total defeat. He let go of the edge of the stage, his arms falling limply to his sides as he slumped backward onto his heels. He had absolutely nothing left to say, and absolutely nowhere left to hide. The federal agents stepped forward from the shadows, their handcuffs gleaming under the chandelier lights, ready to drag the ruined king of Oakridge out of the ballroom and into the cold, unforgiving night. The federal agents pulled Marcus to his feet, snapping the cold steel cuffs around his wrists, right there in the ballroom, but that humiliating exit was merely the prologue to the absolute devastation that followed. The real public spectacle was carefully scheduled for the days to come. The 24-hour eviction notice I had dropped on his chest was not an empty threat. It was a ticking time bomb, and when the clock finally struck 0, the explosion was absolute. The true dismantling of the Jenkins empire began on a crisp, unforgiving Tuesday morning. A convoy of black federal SUVs shattered the quiet dawn of the commercial district. The luxury car dealership that Marcus had used as his personal piggy bank was completely swarmed. Federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering marched through the glass showroom doors. They carried empty cardboard boxes, moving with clinical efficiency to seize every ledger hard drive and fabricated contract. Marcus, having miraculously secured a temporary bail the night before, had foolishly tried to return to the property before sunrise to desperately shred documents. The agents caught him red-handed in his former corner office. This time there was no service elevator and no hiding from the public eye. They perp-walked him directly out through the massive glass front doors. Local news crews had been tipped off and were already waiting on the sidewalk. Camera flashes exploded like lightning cutting through the early morning fog. Reporters shoved microphones over the police barricades, shouting aggressive questions about the $20 million fraud. Marcus kept his head down, his wrists tightly bound in heavy steel handcuffs. He was wearing the same wrinkled clothes from his night in a holding cell, completely stripped of his Armani armor. He was shoved into the back of a federal vehicle looking exactly like a cornered, terrified animal. Behind him, the massive iron gates of the dealership were violently pulled shut and secured with heavy industrial padlocks. A fleet of flatbed tow trucks began rolling onto the lot, systematically impounding every single gleaming luxury vehicle he had falsely claimed to own. Across town, Brad was experiencing his own highly televised nightmare. The FBI did not wait for the disgraced corporate attorney to wake up and pour his morning coffee. They executed a dawn raid on his sprawling suburban estate. The man who had spent his entire career navigating corporate loopholes found himself completely defenseless when federal marshals pounded on his custom mahogany front door with a battering ram. They hauled him out onto his perfectly manicured lawn. He was not wearing his bespoke corporate suits or flashing his expensive watch. He was wearing wrinkled sleepwear, his face pale, unwashed, and slack with terror. The wealthy neighbors stood on their expansive front porches, clutching their morning coffees, watching in absolute stunned silence as the neighborhood's golden boy was paraded in handcuffs. News helicopters circled loudly overhead, capturing the entire humiliating scene from the sky. Lauren was standing in the doorway, but she was not crying for her husband. She was aggressively barking orders at premium movers, packing her own designer bags, and preparing to sprint directly to a ruthless divorce attorney. Brad was shoved into a federal SUV, his corporate arrogance completely and permanently erased. While the men were being processed through the bleak federal holding center, the IRS descended on the Jenkins family mansion. Vivian was formally served with immediate asset forfeiture papers. The federal government officially seized the sprawling estate, the frozen bank accounts, the imported artwork, and every piece of jewelry purchased with stolen corporate funds. The marshals gave her exactly 1 hour to gather her personal clothing and vacate the premises. She could not take the matching designer luggage sets. They were all catalogued as evidence of the embezzlement scheme. Instead, Vivian Jenkins, the former undisputed queen of Oak Ridge society, was forced to pack her sparse belongings into a cheap battered canvas suitcase she had frantically dug out of the basement storage. She dragged it down the grand sweeping staircase, her face a mask of pure hollow horror, as federal agents meticulously tagged and catalogued her former kingdom. With her credit cards entirely declined and her wealthy country club friends completely blacklisting her calls, Vivian had absolutely no choice but to hail a cheap local taxi. She directed the driver to the extreme outskirts of the city, far away from the gated communities and private security patrols. She was forced to rent a room in a dilapidated, run-down motel. It was a miserable concrete box with peeling yellow wallpaper, a flickering neon sign buzzing loudly outside the single dirty window, and the overwhelming, suffocating stench of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. It was the exact type of impoverished, forgotten neighborhood she had relentlessly mocked me for growing up in. The poetic justice was absolute and unforgiving. Vivian sat on the edge of a sagging, stained mattress, clutching her single canvas suitcase, entirely stripped of the manufactured wealth that had defined her entire existence. She stared blankly at the peeling paint, listening to the roar of highway traffic outside, realizing that this dingy room was her permanent new reality. The legal hammer had fallen with uncompromising, brutal force. There were no secret offshore accounts left to drain. There were no high-powered defense lawyers willing to take their case without a massive retainer they could no longer afford. Marcus and Brad were sitting in cold concrete, holding cells, actively facing decades in federal prison for grand larceny and wire fraud. Vivian was completely isolated in a decaying motel room, entirely forgotten and discarded by the society she had worshipped. They had conspired to break me, to steal my legacy, and to bury me in the snow. Instead, they had flawlessly engineered their own total permanent annihilation, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the wreckage of their own greed. 6 months passed, bringing with them the warm, revitalizing breath of spring. The bitter, freezing winter that had violently dismantled the Jenkins family was nothing more than a fading memory. The heavy snow had melted away, revealing a fertile ground ripe for absolute transformation. I walked out of my newly appointed executive office, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete floor of my sprawling commercial property. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of blooming cherry blossoms and the buzzing electric energy of raw, unfiltered progress. The massive acreage that had once housed Marcus's corrupt luxury car dealership was completely unrecognizable. I had systematically purged every single trace of his toxic legacy, tearing down the gaudy showrooms and the backroom dealing tables. In their place stood a gleaming state-of-the-art logistics hub and a sprawling community center specifically designed to incubate minority-owned startups. It was a brilliant, thriving ecosystem of genuine hard work and actual innovation. Floor-to-ceiling windows allowed natural light to flood the collaborative workspaces where brilliant young entrepreneurs were building their own empires. There were no embezzled funds here. There were no fraudulent ledgers and no predatory contracts. I had taken the physical manifestation of Marcus's greed and repurposed it into a monument of undeniable generational wealth. I strolled through the central open-air plaza, waving at the new business owners who greeted me with genuine smiles and profound respect. I was no longer the discarded wife hiding in the shadows of a manufactured high society. I was the sole proprietor, the visionary, and the undisputed architect of my own destiny. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely rewritten. As I approached the center of the plaza, my eyes drifted toward the massive digital billboard mounted above the main entrance. It usually displayed community announcements or market analytics, but today the local news station had taken over the feed. The breaking news banner flashed in bright red letters, completely arresting the attention of the plaza. The anchor's voice echoed crisp and clear across the courtyard, announcing the final verdict in the most sensational federal fraud case the state had seen in a decade. The screen cut to a live shot outside the federal courthouse. Marcus and Brad were being led down the stone steps, their wrists bound in heavy steel chains, their ankles shackled together. They were wearing identical drab khaki prison jumpsuits, entirely stripped of their former arrogance. The news anchor confirmed the judge's merciless ruling. Marcus Jenkins and Bradley Vance had both been formally convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. They were each sentenced to serve a mandatory minimum of 5 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. I stood perfectly still, watching the screen as Marcus was shoved into the back of the armored transport van. There was no defiance left in his posture. He looked hollow-aged and entirely broken. The camera lingered on the transport van as it pulled away, carrying the men off to a grim, regimented life of concrete and steel. The legal execution was completely finalized. The ghosts of my past were officially locked away in a cage. I turned away from the digital screen, feeling a profound, weightless sense of closure wash over my entire spirit. I looked across the manicured green lawn of the courtyard, and my heart instantly swelled. Darius was sitting comfortably on a wrought iron park bench, bathed in the warm spring sunlight. He had traded his sharp, intimidating courtroom suits for a relaxed linen button-down, looking completely at peace. He had been my unyielding shield during the brutal winter, and now he was sharing in the absolute triumph of the spring. But my eyes were entirely captivated by the tiny, beautiful force of nature standing just a few feet away from him. Little Zuri was wearing a bright yellow sundress, her dark curls bouncing in the gentle breeze. She giggled, a bright musical sound that echoed perfectly across the courtyard. She let go of the edge of the bench, her tiny legs wobbling as she found her balance. Darius held his hands out, offering a wide, encouraging smile. With a burst of brave determination, Zuri took a step forward. Then another, and another. She was walking. Her very first independent steps on the fresh green grass of the empire I had secured for her. I felt tears of pure, unadulterated joy prick the corners of my eyes. I hurried across the lawn, closing the distance just as Zuri tumbled forward into Darius's waiting arms. He caught her effortlessly, lifting her high into the air and spinning her around as she squealed with absolute delight. I reached them, and Darius gently handed her over to me. I pulled my daughter tightly against my chest, burying my face in her soft hair, breathing in the sweet, innocent scent of her. She wrapped her tiny arms around my neck, resting her head against my shoulder, completely safe, completely loved, and entirely secure. Darius stood up, placing a warm, steady hand on the small of my back. We stood together, looking out over the bustling, sunlit plaza. The logistics hub was operating flawlessly. The community center was thriving. The legacy I had built from the ashes of betrayal was standing tall and indestructible. I held my daughter close, feeling the rhythmic beating of her heart against mine. I thought about the freezing night I was thrown into the snow, terrified and broken. I thought about the agonizing climb out of the darkness and the ruthless precision it took to reclaim my life. I looked down at Zuri and smiled a deep, genuine smile that reached my very soul. The Jenkins family had tried to bury me in a blizzard of lies and financial ruin. They thought I was weak. They thought I would freeze and simply fade away. But they had tragically misunderstood the woman they were dealing with. I didn't just survive the storm, I became the storm. And now, looking out over the beautiful, thriving empire I had built for my daughter, I knew the ultimate truth. I owned the weather. The perfect, sweet revenge was finally complete. The most profound lesson from this journey is that your true value is never defined by the harsh judgments of those who consistently underestimate you. When toxic individuals try to aggressively diminish your worth, the absolute best response is quiet, relentless perseverance. True strength lies in secretly building your own independence and strategically waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim your narrative. You do not owe your loyalty to those who offer only conditional love. By establishing unbreakable boundaries and fiercely protecting your peace, you prove that living an authentic, successful life is always the ultimate, sweetest revenge. Share your own inspiring story of overcoming toxic family dynamics in the comments below, and hit subscribe for more empowering tales of triumph.